Today's discussion is part of an exciting lineup hosted this week by the University of Washington's Center for Journalism, Media, and Democracy. Yesterday, we had Jorge Ramos join us to talk about journalism and the 2020 election. And tomorrow, Lance Bennett will be joining CJMD co-directors Matt Powers and Adrian Russell to discuss media and politics in the election. So in yet another highly charged presidential race, the American public remains polarized on virtually all issues. And in the midst of a pandemic that has taken 226,000 lives in the US alone, we have seen an unprecedented 60 million Americans casting early ballots already. So as tumultuous as our political landscape might be, it also offers incredible fodder for today's conversation, which focuses on public opinion and polling. I'm Patricia Moy. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Communication, which houses the CJMD, and I'm absolutely delighted to moderate today's conversation. We have with us two experts who've been in high demand this season and beyond, and we're extremely grateful for the time they're able to spend with us. We have Kate Kenski, who is a professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Arizona, where she teaches political communication, public opinion, and research methods. She's the former senior analyst at the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania. She's also the co-author of the award-winning book, The Obama Victory: How Media, Money, and Message Shaped the 2008 Election, as well as Capturing Campaign Dynamics, the National Annenberg Election Survey. Kate's current research focuses on social media and incivility. It focuses on gender and politics, as well as online platform development that aids users' quality of reasoning. She's chaired the political communication divisions of both the National Communication Association and the American Political Science Association, and she has served as an associate editor of Public Opinion Quarterly and the International Journal of Public Opinion Research. We also have with us Lydia Saad, who is the director of US Social Research at Gallup, where she oversees the development of surveys for the US Gallup poll, our most recognized and longest running continuous monitor of American public opinion. As director, she also reports the data on Gallup's news website. Lydia is the leading expert on presidential approval ratings and how economic conditions shape voting patterns. And this year's election will be her 8th since joining Gallup in 1992. She's an active member of the American Association for Public Opinion Research, APOR, having finished her second term just this summer on its executive council, most recently as its secretary-treasurer. She's a member of the APOR 2016 and 2020 task forces that analyzed the poll's performance during the election season. Kate, Lydia, thank you both for being here. Lydia, I know you have a hard stop at 4 p.m. Eastern, so we'll discuss more general salient questions for the first part of the hour, then take questions from attendees via the chat box. We will end the recording at 1 o'clock. Kate will stay on informally to answer other questions. And for all attendees, feel free to register your questions anytime as they come up. We'll save them for later. Okay, so let's start with some context. Lydia, you work for Gallup, and Gallup was the first to measure presidential approval back when Trump was in office. Can you tell us how the approval ratings for Trump compare to those for previous presidents?
Hi, Patricia, thank you. I had to unmute, I finally did it. Sure, so presidential approval, first of all, is relevant in this situation because historically it's had a very close relationship with the outcome of elections, and even more specifically, the president's share of the popular vote in elections. Dr. Gallup developed the presidential approval rating back in the 30s as a way to monitor presidential popularity between elections. And it turns out to be a pretty good surrogate for vote choice. So right now, President Trump has a 43% job approval rating in the Gallup poll, and that's very similar to what you would see if you go on Real Clear Politics or something and look at all the ratings. Kind of remarkable consistency across pollsters lately for his rating. And so historically, and we'll just kind of look at, well, we could go all the way back to Eisenhower, but just modern history here. At this same time, right before the election in 2012, Obama, seeking re-election, had a 52% job approval rating. George W. Bush, oddly enough, had a 48%, but he had been bobbing right under 50% all October. He had a 51%, a 50%, a 48%. Our final reading on him was 48, but he had been at 50% within the month. Clinton had a 54 in 96. All of those presidents won re-election. You have to go back to George H.W. Bush for an incumbent who lost in 92, and he had a 34% job approval. Ronald Reagan in 84 had a 58, well above the 50% mark, won re-election in a landslide. Carter, 37. Again, clear, nothing near that 50% mark, and he lost re-election. So Trump at a 43 is in a little bit of a no man's zone. No president has been at that level before. We can't say with certainty that no president with a 43 has been reelected, but it would certainly be well below the prior threshold of 48 set by Bush. And it seems to be equating to what we're seeing in the national polls for his vote margin.
I appreciate how you're not making absolute statements, and I promise we won't hold you to any of those. So we also know with presidential approval ratings, they're generally tied to people's political leanings. And we unfortunately, over the years, have seen an electorate that has become increasingly fractious. Kate, you're a political communication scholar. What political issues and cultural issues do you think are most further cleaving the American public?
Well, it's amazing because it used to be that we would say that people were divided more on their impressions than on the issues, but I certainly think we've seen, quite a few divides that have either remained or widened. On racial issues, there was a poll recently done by Pew in September, and it asked people whether or not the focus on racial issues was going to help or change in some way racial inequalities. When looking at white Democrats or Democratic leaners compared to Republican leaners or Republicans, there was a difference of 62% thinking that it was going to result in a change for the Democratic side to 35% on the Republican side. And so that's a sizable gap on whether or not the focus on race was going to bring about change. Same question, but asked whether or not there was going to be improvement in Black lives because of the focus on racial issues. And that was a difference of 77% Democratic, white Democratic leaners to 30% Republicans and Republican leaners. So that issue alone. Over the summer, there were questions that were asked again by Pew about issues revolving around the police. And so one question asked whether or not people thought that civilians needed to have the power to sue police when excessive force was used. Again, comparing Democrats to Republicans, 84% of Democrats thought that citizens should have that power to sue if excessive force was used, in comparison to 45% of Republicans. And more recently, when asking people questions about whether or not colleges have made the right decision to bring students back to campus, another huge gap. Only 29% of Democrats think that colleges have made the right decision, in comparison to 74% of Republicans and Republican leaners. So on all these series of issues, the ones that are in the news, we see major gaps in how Republicans and Democrats are approaching those issues. And even when it comes to not what the issue positions are, but whether or not the issues are important. Again, we can go to an October 21st release, again by Pew, and major differences in the importance. And so when people were asked the standard question about how important various issues were, looking at those who thought these issues were very important on healthcare, 82% of Democrats say that's a very important issue, in comparison to 44% of Republicans. On the issue of the economy, there's a gap. It's not as big as some of the other issues, but there's still a gap. Those who are on the Trump or Trump-leaning side, 84% say it's important in comparison to 66% of those who are either supporting Biden or Biden supporters. Now, perhaps not surprisingly, again, on whether or not these issues are very important, one where there's an immense chasm is on the issue of whether or not the coronavirus outbreak is very important. The Trump side, the Trump leaners, only 24% think that's a very important issue in comparison to the Biden side, which says that it's, it's around 82% think that that's a very important issue. There are, of course, a few issues on which both sides are in the same zones of importance. And so on the issue of abortion, 48% of the Trump side says that's very important in comparison to 42% of the Biden side. And same with Supreme Court nominations. They're both in the 64 to 66% zone. And so there's some issues in which both sides seem to agree, but there are enough other issues where I think we could call it a chasm between the sides of the political spectrum.
Let me follow up on that. So Lydia, you and former editor-in-chief Frank Newport are coming out with a review in Public Opinion Quarterly on presidential approval. And in that, you talk about how this increasing polarization really has thrown a monkey wrench into how we understand presidential approval. Tell us what challenges there are, because if everyone is fractured, if everyone is just disagreeing with each other, how do we make sense of a national public opinion?
Gosh, well, so first let me just describe the state of affairs, and I have to acknowledge the work of my colleague Jeff Jones at Gallup, our managing editor, who has closely followed polarization of presidential approval ratings and helped us document it, the averages historically. So I think we finally hit an 80% partisan divide in job approval ratings of President Trump, with over 90% of Republicans approving and fewer than 10% of Democrats on average, say in the last quarter. And so that 80-point gap compares with a 70-point gap over the course of President Obama's term, a 61-point gap over George W. Bush's term, a 55-point gap over Clinton's term, a 38-point gap over George H.W. Bush's term. So you can see the pattern. It's been getting more polarized. There is an exception to that, and that was Reagan. He was at a 52% partisan gap on approval of him, 83% of Republicans versus 31% of Democrats across his eight years in office. So he kind of, there was a low polarization, kind of spiked for Reagan. It came back down for George H.W. Bush. Part of that had to do with the huge rally events around the Iraq War that were galvanizing to all Americans. But even the first year of his presidency, he was not a divisive figure. People supported the things he was trying to do on 1,000 Points of Light and education and things that partisans tended to agree on. So since the first Bush, it's just gotten more and more polarized, and you can't get any more polarized than we are today. So one thing you might say is it might, the wave might recede a little bit. We might have a little less polarization next time around. We might not. We might just be stuck here. It might be part of the reality of living in a social media world and, tribal cable news and all of that sort of thing, reinforcing confirmation bias and the whole stew of things that lead up to these kind of numbers. If we do continue to have this kind of polarization, it's going to affect what we call the life cycle of presidential approval, because normally presidents start with a relatively high approval rating at the start of their presidency, have a honeymoon. It sinks down usually over that first year. Sometimes presidents run into recessions and things their first term. It bottoms out, it comes back up before re-election, and then they usually do a little better their second term. Trump had an incredibly flat approval rating like no other president. He had a very tiny honeymoon. Maybe you could calculate it at 3 points on average if you look at his first quarter versus his next 2 quarters. And he's had no rally events, which might speak to the fact that there haven't been any international crises during his presidency that would create a rally event. But without those sorts of things, we just see a very flat line, and it'll be just, I don't know, we just have to see what comes next. It'll be very interesting to see if any of these things can be unwound quickly, or this is where we're going to be for a while. Does that answer the question?
It does, but we will move to the bigger question that everyone wants to hear about, and that is how, as two individuals who have been approached by numerous media outlets, numerous organizations, I'm sure one question that you always get is, okay, people don't trust the polls. We had in 2015, we had the Israeli legislative election. We had the UK general election in 2016. We had Brexit. We had Trump over Clinton. What two things are you telling people? I don't trust polls. What are you telling them? Two things.
One thing that whenever, and this was, pre-Trump era, that I always said, I get frustrated when people would say, but the polls are wrong or they're absolutely off. I think it's understandable when people don't have a background in statistics to really want to focus on the point estimates or those averages. But statistics, are trying to represent a reality. They're not the reality itself. And so we always have to look at those margins of error, and really we should be thinking about things in terms of confidence intervals. And I know this does not make a nice, pithy story for the media, but we should be thinking about data in terms of the confidence intervals, and that the truth lies somewhere in that range, not that they should focus on the exact estimate itself. It needs to be thought about in terms of a range of truth, and where is the range of truth? Does it happen to fall in the zone? I think when people say they don't trust the polls, it's because the average that they had in their mind because of the poll they read is off from the reality. And the answer is, well, of course it's off from the reality, because that poll, was offering you a range. It shouldn't have been offering you an exact average. The second thing that I think people need to keep in mind is that polls, are a moment in time, and they may quite accurately, maybe the point estimate is right, reflect that moment in time. But when we're in a campaign, campaigns are dynamic, and there are forces that can change not only how people feel about the candidates. It might not affect people that way, but it can affect whether or not they feel like voting on election day. And I think that's one thing that people often overlook. One of the ways, what campaigns do is not necessarily change who we're going to vote for, but they change our enthusiasm behind that possible vote, or maybe dampen down the enthusiasm, and therefore we want to stay home.
Lydia?
Well, the two things I say to people are that the national polls were very accurate in 2016, with an average estimate of the gap between Clinton and Trump at about 3%, and she won by 2.1. So that's number one. And number two, that the misperception that Clinton was a shoo-in to win was the result of aggregators looking at state polls, modeling the Electoral College, that it violated just what Kate said you shouldn't do, which is forget about the margin of error, and forget that these polls are a moment in time, and that some of these polls stopped a week early. And so we allowed people doing that kind of analysis to go too far out on a limb, accepting some of these things that had error around them as the truth, and that there have been changes made since then, both in more awareness that these are very dynamic races when you have the president and the his challenger in the states right up into the last day, moving votes. The polls need to be current, and that there is a unique dynamic for Donald Trump with the non-college population that often doesn't vote being in his camp, and that special care needs to be taken with survey weighting to be done properly to account for that. So there's been improvements in that this year, and we hope the polls are correct.
Can you talk more about what improvements or how polling has changed between 2016 and 2020?
Not much, I don't think, on the national level, because the national polls are always weighted by education. The leading polls that you read about, they always include education in their weighting schemes. That's been a standard. It's the state polls that, for whatever reason, haven't always done that. I think, I'm no expert on it. I think 538 has done a very good job of evaluating what's happening with these state polls and documenting that more polls are now weighting by education. And then usually polls that are panel studies already weight by education. And with some more polls being online panel studies, that's automatically happening. So, but still, maybe if it was 20% that were weighting by education in 2015, it's now like 50%. So there's still a little concern there that there's not quite enough of that going on. But I have no reason to believe that the national polls will be any less accurate this time around. I think I feel like the country has gotten such an education in the last 4 years in polling and civics. Polling in terms of understanding how pollsters weight things, how polls are done, the difference between state and national polls, and then civics in terms of the popular vote versus the electoral college. And I think people ought to understand much better this time that there's a very high chance that the winner of the popular vote is not going to be the same as the electoral college, and that it's much more complex to say who's going to win in these swing states.
If I could follow up on that, because I think that's an incredibly important point. I think that polling is fantastic. I love survey data, but I think it's also given us, I guess, a misrepresentation of the way our system of government works, because we see so many national polls on the national news. And I think that Americans, have begun to think that, it's one person, one vote, the poll says such and such a candidate should win. If you really wanted to know, though, try to predict ahead, you almost would focus exclusively on those battleground states. And as it turns out, a lot of the state polls, when you look at the numbers that are being calculated out of them, they tend to be much smaller than the national polls, but they still have big margins of error. I just saw a poll the other day that was in Texas, and the headline leading, in around that poll was that Biden is up in Texas. If you looked at the details of that poll, it was clearly within the margin of error, and it really wasn't possible for the headline, to make a declarative statement that Biden was ahead. And so if anyone really wants to know where Biden is at in Texas, you need to conduct a poll that has the sample size behind it to shrink the margin of error to really give you more confidence that he is or is not ahead. So that's one thing. And so I do think that unfortunately, again, it's good that we're becoming more aware of polls. I am pleased occasionally when I see people talking about margins of error, but if we're thinking about national polls, that's going to skew people's attention away, or lead them away from really thinking about the electoral college. One thing I'll just say, it surprises me that after 2000, Americans didn't really grasp that really the electoral college is where it's at. 2000 should have done that. Last time should have done it. And so we really need to change how we think about our political system.
Kate, I'm glad you mentioned the media, because we cannot, for an event sponsored by the Center for Journalism, Media and Democracy, cannot talk about polls without talking about the media. The two are inextricably linked. How do you evaluate, from your perspectives, how do you evaluate media coverage of polls? You talked a little bit about the types of surveys that are being conducted, but what about media coverage?
It's what I alluded to with the one headline again that I saw the other day, where Biden is ahead. It is really, against journalistic standards, or like what makes a good story. Usually it's not saying there's a statistical dead heat. That doesn't exactly sound like a super compelling story. You can flip it to say, hey, it's really competitive and hopefully, get the juices and people interested. But I think that when you're trying to tell a clear narrative, you want a winner and you want a loser, because that makes for an easy headline that's easy for people to understand. And so what I'm seeing is when we look at, various headlines, it is using that so-and-so is ahead, or it'll say something like Trump ahead or Biden ahead, but then the details of the article will explain that, well, it's in with this margin of error. I think that we do know that people tend to read headlines. They tend to read first paragraphs. They don't tend to go into the details. And so to that extent, I think there is concern that the headlines are misleading people's impressions of what's going on. I will say that I have seen some editorial pieces, cautioning Democrats for getting too optimistic about Biden being ahead in some of those, poll aggregators. But I would say there's not enough of that. And, education is one answer. Another answer is maybe we need to figure out how to develop frames to offer to journalists so that they can feel comfortable using those frames and offering people a more accurate portrait of what's happening in the American electorate.
And that's what APOR is doing with training sessions for journalists. Is there, Lydia, do you think there's too much horse race coverage? I'm asking you a loaded question for someone who conducts polls on a regular basis, but are we inundated with polls in the media? Do you receive journalist calls asking for just the soundbite? Tell me what your perspective is.
Well, I'm in I guess to me, the enviable position of Gallup has moved away from tracking the horse race. Mm-hmm. So after 2012, we made the decision not to follow the horse race. And so we weren't polling in 2016 on that. We're not doing it this year. We have the luxury of being able to focus on what I call the atmospherics, the presidential approval, and what does that mean? Economic confidence, and how does that factor into the election? Evaluations of the candidates' characteristics, issue priorities for the public, all those things. And I'm very pleased that we continue to get a lot of contact outreach from the press for our information. We thought when we stopped doing the horse race, everyone's going to maybe forget about Gallup in elections. We'll, go off and do something else. But I think there is still a huge appetite for the context of elections that we provide. But there's no doubt that the dominant, metric out there are the trial heat polls. I think this year people are they're very frightened. they're that memory. I don't want to say PTSD, but there's a lot of feeling like we thought we knew it was going to happen last time and it didn't happen. We don't want to make that mistake again. So there's a lot of caution in reporting the trial heat. And so in some ways they're looking for more context to put around the numbers to make sense of them than to just focus on a number that might be wrong. That's kind of how I see it. I see a lot of everything. I see some really excellent work done. New York Times had an excellent article explaining how the polls differ today versus 2016 and why you can still trust the polls. Some of the networks have done that sort of thing as well. At the same time, I think it's really important what Kate said is that, we're expecting journalists to pick up our numbers and write about them and make sense of them and put the correct caveats around them. And they really don't know how to do that. So, the worst thing I see is, well, this is the number, but the polls were wrong the last time. And that reinforces that error in interpretation that is so damaging for polling and I think for democracy when people don't trust the polls, especially coming out of an election like this. If either way, the outcome.
Is Lydia frozen?
Polls as it check out results to say, no, this is what the polls showed. Then that's really going to be a problem.
Let's switch gears a little bit to the larger question, and I'm starting to see questions float in. We talked about democracy just now and what polls are supposed to do, but obviously it's very contextualized. All of these polls are within a single context of this larger campaign. Campaigns used to rely on events like conventions, like debates, to win over undecided voters, to convert people, to activate, and to reinforce attitudes. So debates they used to be events where you had the candidates speaking very articulately for 120 seconds and trying to persuade audience members of their stances. And the viewers in an ideal world were supposed to process this information very rationally and then decide on a candidate. But that's clearly not happening. What's going on? In this race, are there still persuadable voters out there? Are the undecideds really undecided, or are they the shy Trumpers or the shy Bideners?
I think that's an excellent question. I would say it's hard to say until we see sort of the end results and then look at post-election data to see what's happened in terms of pre-post changes. Mm-hmm. I would venture that because we are coming, it's always been the case that if you were a Republican, you are going to be more likely to vote for the Republican candidate. And if you were a Democrat, you were going to be more likely to vote for the Democrat. That really has, that's changed a little bit in terms of the in terms of the were you going to vote for this candidate or not, but really not by much, because already from the start, you were more likely to vote for your side, which makes sense. I think what's different today and what makes people less persuadable and less willing to at least listen to the other side is that the polarization has meant not only am I on this side, but I'm way far on the intensity. And that changes how I process things. So I don't think that there's actually that many persuadable voters left. But having said that, I think what campaign events do, like the forums, like the debates, is basically either stoke someone's enthusiasm or dampen it down. Just on not necessarily the national scene, but I know at one of the state debates that we had between Senate candidates, I was talking with a reporter, and she was just surprised at that the debate didn't have an audience, but people were watching it outside the room where the debate was held. And when the candidates left the room, both sides had people cheering and clearly felt their side won. And I think, again, that's sort of the same with presidential. If you went into the debate watching it and you were already for Trump, you probably were also for Trump leaving the debate. And the question is, were you more enthusiastic than you already were, or had that been dampened down? Same with the Biden side. And so it's not about persuasion, it's about mobilization.
Lydia, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think, again, Trump's approval rating has been so narrow that I don't think anybody who's never approved of the job doing as president is persuadable. I don't think somebody who has always approved of the job Trump has done as president is persuadable. I think theoretically, his approval rating since the start of his presidency has varied from, I think, a low of about 37 to a high of 49. And this year it's an even narrower range from about 40 to 49. So I think the potential for persuadable voters is somewhere in that range between 40 and 49. So maybe 90% of Americans could be persuaded. If an election with an incumbent is a referendum on the incumbent, and you have this memory of sometime in the last year approving of the job that person's doing, maybe there's some movement there possible. Even if the undecided vote in any given poll is only 5%, maybe double is persuadable. But by this point in the campaign, obviously, less opportunity for that. I think that's where it is. I think for previous presidents where there was a point when 60 some odd % might have approved of the person on the job they were doing, they just had a larger bank of kind of goodwill behind them to draw on than Trump does.
You mentioned where we are in the campaign. We are 7 days out, with 60 million Americans having voted already. In 2016, many people said, including Nate Silver, said that Hillary Clinton would have won the election had James Comey not written the letter to Congress 10 or 11 days before Election Day. To what extent do you think last minute events will make a difference? So everyone talked about Trump coming down, testing positive for COVID-19 as the October surprise. And now we have Pence's inner team coming down with COVID-19 as well. And then in the third debate, or the second presidential debate that was in person, issues about how Biden stood on moving and transitioning the country away from oil dependence, that came up as an issue. To what extent are these issues going to make a difference in the end? Do you see anything? I'm asking you to look into your crystal ball, but what should we be looking out for given where we are now?
Well, one thing, and this is why I think early voting is important. One of the things that early voting does, with so many people having voted early, is that the pool that can be affected by those last minute events has now shrunk. And so I think we have to keep that in mind. So I don't know if we have quite as much of the swing possible this time around. That Comey letter came out on October 28. And so I would say the way 2020 has been going, I wouldn't discount any last minute surprises that could change things. But I do think that if the really enthusiastic voters have already cast their ballots, the October surprise would be affecting a different type of portion of the electorate. So it's going to be those people who have just been lukewarm all the way along. And so I would say it's still possible. I think there's been too many surprises in 2020, so I'm hoping that we stay the course.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that at this point it's going to be things that affect swing voters in swing states, like that oil issue. I mean, I think that's why we're seeing Trump parking himself in Pennsylvania at this point. So I just don't see a mathematical possibility that some of those bigger things like Trump, potentially Pence gets knocked off the campaign trail by COVID or something like that, moving the needle. But if it also just depends on how close it really is in the end. If these are 5-point races, it's not going to matter. If they're 1-point races, anything can matter.
Lydia, let me ask you, let's turn to some of the questions that are being registered in our chat. So this is from Rico Neumann, who's a student at the UW. What are some new and ongoing concerns or challenges for pollsters with respect to the 2020 election? Specifically, how has COVID-19 affected the polling process and polling results this year?
Well, as you'll hear from a lot of pollsters, COVID in some ways made it easier. Not a lot, not as much as you might have thought, but especially early on when we were polling a lot about COVID, people were more likely to talk to pollsters a little bit. But that's kind of dissipated. I can't say that, COVID affected phone rooms, which affected how we poll. I think there were many phone rooms disrupted by not being able to have all their people come together in a space. And so in some cases, pollsters are having their staff poll remotely. I know at Gallup, they're back working in a phone center for the most part, but so that, there was a little disruption there. Of course, polls that are done online, Gallup has a very large panel survey. We have over 80,000 to 100,000 Gallup panelists who are probability-based selected into a panel. And so we do those polls by internet. And that wasn't disrupted at all. We relied on that actually for daily tracking of COVID attitudes from mid-March through the summer. And we're still doing it on a monthly basis. So COVID has not been bad to polling. We've been lucky as a profession in that sense, that our product has been needed more than ever. And it's been easy as ever to do the job.
That's
as ever, whichever way you want to look at it.
Which is heartening, which is very heartening. We have another question that deals more with specific polls. This is from Polly Straub-Cook, UW student. This is about 538. Between the polls, we often see variance that exceeds the overall 538 margin of error. For example, today, the BC Dornsife has Biden at 11 points up in Pennsylvania, whereas the AB TIPP poll has him at 4 points up. What are they doing differently, and how can they come up with such strikingly different results? And what does Rasmussen do to consistently come up with results that favor the right? Polly, we have classes on survey research where we'll learn about question wording, but Lydia.
Gosh, I can't answer about those polls in particular. I mean, you just have to hope that they are transparent about their methods. You have to look at their question wording, their question order, all those things you have to look at on surveys. You have to know how many interviews, what's the modality, is it internet or phone, what are the weight factors, are they including leaners in the vote or not? I don't know, it could be many things. So I think just this is why you have to be a active consumer of polls. You can't just look at the numbers. As you can see, if you only saw one number, you say, oh, that's the poll. But as soon as you see two, you know, okay, I've got work to do to figure out what's going on here. So, and the other part of that question had to do with
Rasmussen on the right.
Oh, Rasmussen, right? I don't know. I don't know why, but he does, and I don't pay a lot of attention to it because I not because I don't like his number, but because I haven't had any reason to believe that he's more accurate than everybody else. And when you're consistently in outline like that, there's some kind of house effect going on. So it's better to look at trends than an individual number from firms like that, see which way the trends are going.
I'm going to ask you to elaborate for individuals, house effect.
Oh, house effect. Well, certain polling firms might have a slightly more Republican or more Democratic bent in their numbers, say for presidential job approval on average. Not every poll that they do will come out that way, but when you look at the averages across certain polls, you'll see they be a little lower, a little higher for, say, President Trump and his approval rating. And when you dig into those might be things that have to do with how hard that particular survey research firm was undecided on the phone. So when someone says, I don't know, some may have a policy, you just record don't know. Others may have a policy, you probe that person and push them for an answer. That can often consistently skew an approval rating up because people who have a negative opinion are sure of it and will give it to you. If they're wishy-washy, they might, be more likely to say undecided. If you push them, they'll say, okay, it's positive. So little things like that are differences across firms. Maybe the gender or racial balance of the interviewing force that firm uses could have a slight factor. All those things are called house effects, things that are methodology related to how a particular poll is conducted that might be a little bit different than another firm. None of it's wrong, but they're just little differences.
Thank you for sharing that vocabulary with us. From Kathleen Becker's University of Antwerp, what do you think the role is of other portrayals of public opinion that journalists use in their news items? Poll reports are often accompanied, for instance, by statements and interpretations by journalists, interviews with voters, or social media posts that sometimes go against the poll information. I guess this is a question about how people process poll stories. If you have a poll if you have a poll story that's only about a poll versus a poll story that includes poll data as well as social media polls, social media information as well as attributions by the journalist, as well as Vox Pop interviews.
I would suspect that when you have that conflicting information, so for example, the poll data says one thing, but then you provide the juiciest, most salacious, perhaps most uncivil social media post to accompany that, I think that we tend to remember those vivid anecdotes. And so I think those, tend to wash the numbers. I think it's not a surprise that in discussions of media coverage, whether things are presented in terms of themes versus episodes, there's a reason why a lot of journalism has focused on the episodes, and that's because I think they resonate most with readers and are easier to remember. And so I would say that when you have that mix of information, it dampens the impact of how people understand the trends or understand the numbers.
Yeah, I interpret that as sort of the difference between quantitative and qualitative data. And the quantitative data, the poll results themselves can be a little dry. You go to a Gallup news.com article and you read our stories, they're going to be a little technical, a little dry. We're giving you a lot of numbers. You go read that same article on Slate or some other Vox or whatever, and they want to bring in that color commentary. They want to find a respondent that represents, or an individual that represents a certain type of respondent, and telling these stories and contextualizing it. And so I think there's a risk there in going, distorting the data. And as you say, kind of forget what the facts are and kind of remember these flashy, tidbits that were offered as opposed to illustrations of that. So that's a risk. As an interesting topic for communications, how journalism should cover, because you see it all the time. They always love to find either actual respondents or a man to represent who's in the poll, and then you're taking all this information and you're leaving the reader with this one or two competing quotes by a Republican and a Democrat that may really not accurately reflect the totality of this data.
We have another question, this one from Gerard Lecomte. On the topic of persuadable voters, is there work being done to understand the portion of persuadable voters that are issue voters and how that compares to the portion of decided voters who are issue voters? For the voters who are not issue voters, do we know much about what drives their decision? Let's tackle this one at a time. Let's start with I'm going to focus the question for you, Lydia, because I know you have to leave shortly. So for those people who are not issue voters and they are potentially undecided, how do we know about what do the data tell us about how they decide? Do we have anything in terms of Gallup data?
Gosh, this kind of ties together what we were talking about in the beginning with polarization on issues. We're at a place today where there's such alignment between where people stand on issues, what party they belong to, and who they're voting for, that there's not a lot of wiggle room there where you say, oh, this person is pro-choice, but they are voting, they're considering voting for Trump or vice versa. And how important is that issue relative to other issues for them, and where are they going to come down? We're at a situation where people, rate the economy and their personal finances and the crime rate in their neighborhood based on who the president is. Everything has to line up with their conception of who the president is. And if it's my president, everything has to be good. And if it's not my president, everything has to be bad. And they're not, like we said, we kind of come down, especially with Trump, to this pretty small group of potentially persuadable voters. And the question is, how do issues factor into their decision as opposed to other things? I don't know the answer in the end, but with Trump, we know a lot of it comes down to likability and character questions that are the drag. And I think right now, COVID is his biggest issue problem. The economy, we didn't even get into this, but normally economic approval drives presidential approval. Well, consumer confidence drives how people feel about the job the president's doing on the economy, which drives how they feel about how the president's doing, which dictates whether they get elected or not. Trump is still getting majority approval ratings on the economy, but it's just not feeding into his job approval rating. He's getting very poor ratings on COVID-19, and not just in his performance on it, but we have another question on tracking asking about the CDC, Trump, and your state governor. Does this person or group care about the health and safety of my community? So people rate the CDC poorly for the job it's doing, but they say they care about the health and safety of my community. They give state governors positive ratings on both those things. They give Trump negative ratings on both those things. So not only is he doing a poor job, he doesn't care about the health and safety of my community. I have to believe that's a pivotal factor right now. And the state of the infection rate right now can't be helping him in these final days on the trail.
What I'd like to do is, because it's very close to 1 o'clock, I want to end the formal portion of our time together with a set of closing questions. Number one, from a professional perspective, what will keep you up at night these next few days? So let's answer that question, and then we'll turn to a more optimistic question before you go, Lydia.
Oh gosh. Yeah, what really bothers me is having an outcome that one side or the other doesn't trust. So Biden wins, and a strong, segment of the Republicans out there believe the election was stolen from him. Or Trump wins, and Democrats just can't believe it given the way the polls were going in. So I guess there's almost nothing we can do about the former, because that is based on a belief that that there is going to be voter fraud and all sorts of things that doesn't reflect back on polling. What really concerns me is that we have another election where the perception is the polls were wrong. And that would be devastating, I think, for our country, kind of ripping it apart. Like, can we trust the results of this election if the polls were wrong? And then what it does to the industry.
Kate?
I would say it's related to trust, not so much polls, but just people not having trust in common sources of information. I think that's been disheartening, because we can't really have a civil discussion or a deliberative discussion if we don't share any of the same premises. If we can't share any assumptions, we can't move further forward. I have one project in the field, and so I don't want to be too reckless here, but it's to say that I have some questions about various conspiracy beliefs, and there are a number of conspiracy beliefs that it's not a majority believe in, but it's enough to know that my fellow citizens, that a portion of them are clearly buying into information that has not been, I would say, established by any mainstream media sources. And so knowing that those QAnon sources are out there, that they're then being perpetuated by people who really want to believe ill of the other side, I think is troubling. And so, then again, if we can't argue, if you believe this belief about a deep state or about, a child trafficking ring, without, telling me exactly where the information comes from, and I don't believe that information, like, where do we go from there? Merely you believing in those same conspiracy beliefs, me thinking that those beliefs are not true, and then the dialogue stops. And so the fact that we don't have common sources of information, that we don't have to agree with at all times, but that we have some commonality so that we have a place for discussion, I think is going to be very troubling, regardless of who wins the presidential election.
Let's end on a bright note. Let's end the formal section on a bright note. So at the end of it all, after all of the state vote totals have been certified, and regardless of the outcome, What is one good thing we can talk about years from now about this electoral season?
A good thing?
Yes.
Well, people are engaged. We see that in percentage paying a lot of attention to the election, thought given to the election. It's going to be a formative experience for a lot of young people. And we may not see the fruits of that for 10 or 20 years, but again, as I said, people are learning a lot this year about polling and civics and science, and it's sort of like, a tree rings on a tree. It's going to be very thick thing this year in the history books. And I think hopefully in the end, it'll all be for good. I don't know. I just go with that.
Kate, what about you?
I'm trying to make it optimistic, Patricia. That's a little bit hard. What I would say is, I think about when I was in graduate school, so 20 years ago, there was a lot of discussion about the trade-offs of having an electorate that was high in participation versus one that was high in knowledge. And I was always on the knowledge end, and I would say that probably the majority of my cohort was on the other end. No, we just need to get people involved. And if they were involved, they would learn things. And so I guess the good thing is, well, we have the participation part, but I think that on the back end, what they're learning may or may not be accurate. And so I guess the one good thing is people are interested. But I think we have a lot of work, channeling that interest. And I don't know, what I would like to see is greater understanding that there is a truth out there. People either committed this crime or they did not. And, that people could, buy into that. I guess the other thing that I will say is just mainly about my state of Arizona. In Arizona, one good thing that we've had for decades is a really, I would say, a good voting system. And so we are not new to early voting or absentee voting. We keep excellent voter records. And so I'm anticipating that in Arizona, regardless of the outcome, I have faith that the votes will in fact be accurately counted.
Okay. Kate Kenski, University of Arizona, Lydia Saad, Gallup. Thank you both for joining us for this 1 hour. We're going to look forward to continuing these discussions, not with you necessarily, but with tomorrow's discussion with Lance Bennett, Matt Powers, and Adrian Russell as they talk about media and politics in the 2020 presidential election. Lydia, I know you have to go, but thank you so much, and I will see you.
Yes.
In other circles.
See you online. Okay,
Yes.
Thank you. Bye-bye.